But good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Goethe Institute. Welcome, I guess, for our writers to Brussels. And welcome to this very special Edinburgh World Writers' Conference event, the Brussels edition. My name is Roland Gulliver. I am the Associate Director of the Edinburgh International Book Festival. The Edinburgh World Writers' Conference was something that began at the Edinburgh International Book Festival last August. It was created to mark the 50th anniversary of something that happened back in 1962, which was this seminal conference that brought together writers from around the world, including Alexander Trocchi and William Burroughs and Norman Mailer, to this seminal event of 2,000 people piling into the McEwen Hall to talk about issues of the day. It was kind of the first literature festival and kind of marks the beginning of Edinburgh as a festival city. Last year, the book festival commemorated this by doing the conference again. We talked about the five same themes that they discussed 50 years ago, which was the politics of the novel, censorship, style and content, the future of the novel, and obviously national literature. The difference last year was that we screened all the events live on the internet, and people tweeted and blogged and commented throughout, as you can do tonight. And since then, it has traveled around the world, taking in many, many destinations. I have a list of going from Berlin to Cape Town to Krasnoyarsk in Siberia to Jaipur to Turkey to Beijing. After tonight, it will go to Trinidad, San Malo, Lisbon, Kuala Lumpur, back to Edinburgh, and then finally finishing in Melbourne in August this year. It's been a remarkable project that's traveled around the world. It has been created in partnership with the Scottish Government's EU office for tonight. It's been in partnership with the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council. Tonight's event has been in association with the Northern Ireland Executive Office, the Welsh Government, and the Permanent Representation of Ireland to the EU. The project overall is supported by the Scottish Government's Edinburgh Festivals Expo Fund, Creative Scotland, the City of Edinburgh, and Event Scotland. There we go. As I mentioned, you can follow the discussions tonight on Twitter. Your hashtag is WorldWritersConf. As well, you can also use the old-fashioned way and talk to us via the microphone. Please do, when you get the microphones, hold it up, because we will be able to hear you, but we're also filming the event. So if you use the microphones, that'll again pick it up. The order of play is that we have two keynote speakers, KASSABOVA and Rashida Lamrabat. They will present their talks, first Kapka and then Rashida. But in between, they'll have responses from Arthur and Christopher, and then Rashida will do her talk, and we'll have responses from Jared and Stella. And then in amongst that, there'll be lots of discussion. Sounds very complicated, but it makes sense, and it will work. It'll be very good. So to continue my housekeeping, I'll introduce all our authors, so you know who they are, where they come from, why they're here, and that'll hopefully be me. So starting with Team Kapka on this. Kapka was raised in Sofia, lived in New Zealand, and then moved to the UK in 2004. She's a novelist, a travel writer, a poet. Her memoir, Street Without a Name, documents her childhood in Bulgaria, which was shortlisted for the Prix de Livre Européen. Her novel, Villa Pacifica, was out 2 years ago, and her latest collection of poetry is A Geography of the Lost. Her latest book, 12 Minutes of Love, is a story of the Argentine tango and the search for home, and was shortlisted for the 2012 Scottish Book Awards. Kapka took part in the World Writers' Conference events in Edinburgh in August. Moving down the line, we have Christopher Meredith, representing Wales, on my piece of paper, sorry, who's an award-winning novelist, poet, and translator, and has written for the radio and the stage. His first novel, Shifts, documents the decline of the steel industry in South Wales and has become a contemporary classic. His recent collection, The Meaning of Flight, was longlisted for the Book of the Year in 2006, and his fourth novel, The Book of Idiots, was published to great acclaim in 2012. Arthur Riordan in the middle is an Irish playwright and actor whose plays include the award-winning Improbable Frequency, and has adapted Ibsen and Flann O'Brien for the stage. His work has included sketches, short work, comedy collaborations, and one-man shows. On my left, Rashida Lamrabat is a Belgian author who works at the Centre for Equality of Opportunity and Opposition to Racism in Brussels. Her writing focuses on the struggles of minorities with identity and migration. Her debut, Mercedes 207, won the Colour the Arts Award, which captures the experiences of a Moroccan man travelling between Antwerp and Morocco. In 2007, she wrote Woman's Country, and in 2008, A Child of God, which won the BNG Literature Award. Gerard McLaughlin is a poet from Northern Ireland. He's been writer-in-residence at the two universities there. He's widely anthologized and translated and has been the subject of 2 television documentaries. He's written for children in Irish, and his last collection is Crisscross Macara, which is both written in Irish and English. And finally, Stella Duffy has written 13 novels, 50 short stories, 10 plays, and has also written for the theatre as a director and has been a performer. She's been longlisted twice for the Orange Prize with The Room of Lost Things and The State of Happiness. She's adapted State of Happiness for cinema, and her series of novels on Empress Theodora have been optioned by HBO. So that is it. That is everything. That's the housework, the housekeeping, your authors, and I shall now hand over to Kapka.
Well, it's great to be here, great to be in Brussels. When I was sort of agonizing over this topic of national literature, capital letters, I was thinking, is this actually any relevance? Is this something that belongs to the past? And then I thought, the fact that I have emotions sort of popping up as I think about this probably means it's not irrelevant. And looking at you here tonight, I don't know how many nations or nationalities there are in the room, but and hopefully we'll hear from everyone later on. But I don't think this is an irrelevant question, the question of national literature. I just make one plea that we always refer to it with a question mark at the end. That's all. A national literature? Last year, at the Olympic event Poetry Parnassus in London, I represented Bulgaria. I accepted the invitation because it was an honor, and I felt like a fraud. Our family emigrated from Bulgaria 20 years ago, and I write in English now. In the past, because I was living and publishing in New Zealand, I attended festivals as a New Zealand writer, and again, felt like a fraud. Today, I'm honored to be here as a writer from Scotland, a country I love and feel at home in, and I'm still struggling with that fraudulent feeling. In short, the idea of national literature gives me a headache. That headache escorts me to public events where you must appear not just with your name and the title of your book, but with your nation too. You must be escorted, as it were, as if you can't be trusted on your own. The headache, I believe, comes from a clash between the private and the public, between my private instinct, shared perhaps by other writers, to unsubscribe from the collective, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the collective claim, which is what all things starting with national do. They claim national literature, national identity, national sport, national pride, national shame, national history. The list is long, and to me, as someone from the Balkans, depressing. I think the 20th century demonstrated in great detail just how nationality, like ethnicity and religion, is an accident, sometimes a lucky escape, sometimes fatal. An unnamed child during the 1990s wars in Yugoslavia, clearly a born poet, had the last word on this, I think. They were going around asking children, do you love your country? And this child said, I love my country because it's small and I feel sorry for it. But when we say national literature, we are uttering an anguished cry of sorts. The very construct national literature is an expression of a nostalgic desire for a home that can be written in terms of nation. It's a desire for innocence, nation as family, mother tongue as home. How lovely and how dangerous. We understand a place through the art that comes out of it. Books, pictures, music. This is what endures when other things go. Political fashions, golden ages, nature itself. I live in the Scottish Highlands, an area of sublime natural beauty, and every day I see another forest go and another pylon replace it. When the forests are gone, what is left are the stories of the forests. Sooner or later, a place becomes its literature. So the real question we're asking, I think, when we say national literature is, where is my home? What is this place? Who are my people? We might say that in the global era, this is an irrelevant question. And I think it probably is privately irrelevant to a lot of people. But it seems to acquire momentum in public. I've seen it passionately discussed in Bulgaria and Britain, among other countries. Each country like a sort of family carrying its ancestral baggage and looking for somewhere to lay it down. So here is a suggestion. What if, in this young century, where we are simultaneously victims and beneficiaries of globalization, there are already two meanings of the word nation, the traditional and the spiritual. We are familiar with the traditional nation-state. It has a capital, it's literature with capital L, and it's in love with its own myths and monuments. The Roma make other Europeans nervous because they are a nation without a state. You can't even tell them in the international language of the thug to go home. They don't have one, except perhaps in music. From Rajasthan to Andalusia, via the Balkans and Eastern Europe, the Romani gypsies are a nation of music. This is not to say their plight is romantic, being the underdog is not romantic. It's to say that gypsy music distills all human exile. Not unlike jazz, the blues and the tango, created in Argentina and Uruguay by immigrants and the dispossessed, and now consecrated by UNESCO as intangible human heritage. Back at Poetry Parnassus, I discovered that the poet from Turkmenistan, Akvel Sapar, lives in Sweden, and Nikola Madzirov, the poet from Macedonia, lives, in his own words, out of a suitcase. The poet from Australia, John Kinsella, is so opposed to nationhood that he once asked for a Red Cross passport. He was denied it, by the way. And when I asked Christodoulos Makris, the poet from Cyprus, who lives in Ireland, how he felt about the whole Olympic thing, he said, well, I could equally be representing Ireland or even Britain. Many poets, of course, lived in their original homelands and wrote in their first language. But the point is, this Parnassian gathering was a mini nation in itself, a nation of poetry. I felt I was among my people, those for whom poetry is more important than other things. I felt at home because, as the poet Christian Morgenstern said, home is where they understand you. On the question of home, here is a haiku by the 17th century poet Basho. Even when I am in Kyoto, when I hear the call of the cuckoo, I miss Kyoto. I've never been to Kyoto, but I miss Kyoto too, because this haiku is not a patriot's song, it's a spiritual incantation, a yearning for the union of the material, which is never enough, with the imagined. Kyoto chiming with the idea of Kyoto. I spent my childhood in Bulgaria in the company of books and languages, as if they were passports that would lead me out into the world. Like many kids, I was homesick for the world. Home ceases to be home when the door is removed, and the Berlin Wall was the opposite of a door. So reading was my internal emigration, my cure for homesickness. Even though I was in Sofia, when I heard the tinkling of the trams, I missed Sofia. Which is why I wrote a memoir 20 years later, Street Without a Name, because when we leave our families or homelands to become more fully ourselves, they haunt us, doubly real with the call of the cuckoo. Joyce Carol Oates said that for most writers, the art of writing is the use to which we put our homesickness. It makes sense. Exile is our essential condition. We are all exiled from a landscape, from an original home, from our own unlived lives. In German, the word is Weltschmerz. In Portuguese, it's saudade. In Spanish, tanguidad, a state of tango. I am yet to hear a writer say that they write to be included in a canon of national literature. How could you? People move countries. Countries move people. The literature of a nation is a mirage, because the concept of nation is a mirage. Stories, however, remain. The Scottish-born Robert Louis Stevenson, one of the world's most translated writers, who died in Samoa and is buried there with his American wife, is to world readers simply a favorite writer. And so with favorite books. Treasure Island, Peter Pan, Sherlock Holmes, Alice in Wonderland, The Little Prince. These are books we grow up with before we even learned the word nation. The novels of Ismail Kadare are read by people who know nothing about Albania. I first discovered Morocco and then Moroccan writers through the fiction of Paul Bowles, an American-born writer. One of my favorite books about Argentina is written by the Polish-born Witold Gombrowicz, who went on a casual visit to Buenos Aires and ended up staying for 24 years. Kafka is almost his own noun now, synonymous not with a country or a language, but with the 20th century, that lover of ideas, that enemy of life. These writers' worlds are cosmopolitan, yet pungently rooted in a specific reality, with all the quirks of place and personality. Cosmopolitanism mustn't be confused with Coca-Cola. It doesn't have to breed cultural homogeneity. It is simply the freedom to come and go, or indeed stay, without the urge to wave a flag. Speaking of flags, we are surrounded by what Nabokov described with the Russian word poshlost, the falsely important, the falsely beautiful, a form of public kitsch. It's what advertising gurus and tribal rhetoricians specialize in the world over. Tribal allegiances, like shopping, give us the illusion of a self, the sugar pill of familiarity. But it's never enough if the spirit center is missing. I think the real task in our lives is to find a truer spiritual home. And this is the point Diogenes was making when he walked around Athens with a lantern, looking for an honest man, he said. When asked where he was from, he said he was a cosmopolites, a citizen of the universe. In defiance to the city-state, which demanded citizenly obedience, his allegiance was simply to common humanity. He lived in an empty tin, and he was a free man. I'm not suggesting we all get ourselves an empty tin. I'm just making a humanist call, in the spirit of the Scottish Enlightenment. Instead of going on a state visit to the mausoleum of national literature, let's inhabit the living cosmopolis of books, art, and music. There are no borders, and no one will ask the purpose of your visit or tell you to go home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kapka. Gentlemen?
Moved to Ireland and went to school there. And he, in his innocence, he told his classmates that he was Irish. And the response was, "That's stupid, I hate that!" When Americans say they're Irish, and you know nothing about us, you think we all live in thatched cottages and believe in leprechauns. Get over it, you're American. This same guy, a few years later, was bemused immediately after 9/11 to meet so many Irish people tearfully declaring that the New York cops were Irish, the firefighters were all Irish, there was a priest, an Irish priest from Brooklyn. And I think this story illustrates a few things. One, I don't think anyone will be surprised to find that we Irish can sometimes sentimentalize ourselves. Another, it's a reminder that there is a worldwide Irish diaspora, and an illustration that we've been doing globalization for several generations. The Irish comedian Tommy Tiernan said that the Irish colonized the world not through imperialism, but through the far more efficacious strategy of infestation. Now, Irish identity. I don't know if you've noticed, there's a little game I play with myself in conversation with other Irish people. And it often happens that Irish people have this impulse to draw parallels and similarities with the most unlikely races. I remember hearing Bono being interviewed a few years ago and maintaining that the Irish are the Italians of Northern Europe. It was, I think, something to do with being emotionally demonstrative. I don't know, it wasn't true anyway. In the 1960s and 1970s, when a lot of Dutch people were buying cottages in the west of Ireland, it was almost a truism to say that, oh, the Dutch are lovely, they're so easygoing, so relaxed, they're really Irish, possibly the Irish of Northern Europe. But I think that this impulse is not to prove that we're like every other race in the world, but it's obviously to prove that we're unlike the race we're most demonstrably similar to, the English. Now, this is quite a task. We're similar climates, we're near neighbours, very similar racial mix, similar cultures built on stodgy food, binge drinking, a love of irony, bogus self-deprecation. So it is quite a task, but of course it makes sense. We write in English, and there is an onus on us to prove that we're not quite like them. And I mean, even our greatest writer, James Joyce, set out to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. And you know, you might say he achieved that with Ulysses, so the pressure is off the rest of us. Though he did draw some parallels between the Irish and the ancient Greeks. So another sign that the Irish are prone to this. Well, I obviously from a much shallower identity pool than Kafka is. So the Irish have traditionally emigrated. A wonderful thing in the past 20 years is that for the first time ever, or at least since Cromwell, there has been net immigration to Ireland. And it will take some time to see I think the cultural fruits of this. I mean, there are certainly already some very young, talented theatre makers from Eastern Europe and from Armenia. But I look forward to the day, a generation hence, when some good-looking Irish people with an interesting surname says, I'm like the Irish, but I'm not them. I'm not the self-obsessed, solipsistic Irish. I'm Polish Irish, or Lebanese Irish, or Lithuanian Irish. I think that's something to look forward to. That's as much of a response as I can make. That's a wonderful speech.
I enjoyed that speech very much, and there was a great deal in it that I concur with wholeheartedly, and I've picked up that phrase public kitsch to describe the paraphernalia of flags and bunting and strange get-up and so on. It's a great phrase. I intend to use it at every opportunity from now on. As a Welshman, I'm very aware that my identity as a Welshman, I mean, I'm lots of other things as well. I'm a bad guitarist, a grandfather, lots of other things. Bad billiards player. We can define our identities in many ways, and nationhood, however problematical the term is one of those things. And I think I've read over some of the documents in the past from these conferences, and one of the things that's interested me is how little attention has been paid to the complexity of the word nation and nationhood. And I think Kafka's speech has started to tease out some of that complexity. And I think quite a lot of the time, people have been speaking about nation when they mean nation state. And the word nation itself is a much richer, more ambiguous and complex term than is the nation state. It's not unnatural in Europe that we should think in terms of the nation state, which is at various times in history constructed in different places at different times. It's particularly a 19th century phenomenon, but it's in the case of England, it's rather earlier, it seems. Just less than 4 weeks ago, And I was in Prešeren Square. Does anybody know Ljubljana? Prešeren Square. Prešeren is the national poet of Slovenia. And this is a country that didn't exist as a state until the 1990s. But it existed as a nation with the idea of a nation before that, and it has this national poet. Now, there's a statue of Prešeren in Prešeren Square, surmounted by an image of a draped, naked muse. And what's interesting is nobody knows what Prešeren looked like, because the only portrait of him was painted after he died. So various politicians, some of them corrupt, were getting up to speak at the feet of Prešeren to the people in this square, and some very moving readings were made as well. At the feet of a statue of a man whose image we don't actually know. Now that to me is an example of the absurd end of this, a national poet, a national literature. There's something absurd about this. What's heartening is the Slovenes that I met were very aware of the ironies and the comedy in a lot of this, and they understood that. However, these symbols manifest themselves anyway. They tend to be there. On the same day, 25,000 people marched through the streets of Ljubljana in an attempt to point out to the government that they didn't agree with what they were doing, and I think they played their part in getting Janez Janša out of power in Slovenia. And I think Slovenia is proving a test case for democracy in a small country. We may not like the idea of nations, but nation states are where we are tending to live. That process is changing, and it's going to continue changing, and who knows what the future will be. But the various nets of language and culture and then political structures cross and overlap in complex ways. And I think as writers, a lot of the time we pay no attention to that. I've got to admit, national identity is something I'm not particularly interested in my own writing as either a poet or a novelist. But some of the time you're negotiating with that. And I discover I'm a Welsh writer when I leave Wales. When I'm in Wales, I'm a writer. But when I move out of Wales, you are a Welsh writer. People in Slovenia were very interested to get me to say something in Welsh, for me to translate a poem. And they were partly interested because of that notion of recognition, a small country, a stateless nation. They were interested in that commonality between us. And there was lots that we could share with irony and humor, I think. There's a great deal of recognition around Europe, I think, in these small countries that have emerged. And there's a great deal of liberalism and hope, I think, in the way it's being approached. I was in Finland shortly before that. And Finland is another interesting case. It's geographically a large country, but in terms of its identity, it's had pressures in all kinds of ways, with being dominated by Sweden on the one hand and Russia on the other. And there are many things that I can recognize in these countries that seem very similar to my experiences as a Welshman. I think there are complications in the nature of the idea of nationhood that mean that we cannot reject the idea of a nation in this complex and nuanced sense entirely. As writers, I think we proceed by not being recruited as manufacturers of public kitsch. Clearly not. We are ourselves, we are whatever we are. And I think we work maybe sometimes to change perceptions of these things. Primarily we're writers, but some of the times we're working to change these things. There's a problem to do with where power resides and where the centres and the peripheries are. A case in point from a few years ago that strikes me is Peter Brook, the great theatre director working in Paris some years ago. Some of you may remember this. He did a fantastic production called the Mahabharata, based on Indian myth. People familiar with this? It was celebrated as a piece of great world theatre. About 2 years later, I remember an Indian theatre company toured Europe with their production of their own quite separate thing, the Mahabharata, based on the same cycle of myths, and it was celebrated as great ethnic theatre. Now that's an interesting light into the perceptions of the people who applied those descriptions. The white European based in Paris, in a big city, was the producer of world theatre. The theatre company based in India coming on to was doing ethnic theatre, and they were doing the same material, essentially. part of it is simply changing people's perceptions. It's relatively easy for an English novelist writing stuff set in London to be taken as an international writer. If I write a story set in rural Wales, I am a Welsh writer rather than an international writer. And that's a problem with the perceptions of the readers, not mine. So that's a perception that comes from the outside. How can I conclude this? I don't know. There's also the thing of language, I think. I think one of the things we must be careful of is that the economic power and the magnetic pull of the English language and the American English language is so powerfully there that many, many writers are moving, and I'm not criticizing Kafka for this at all, her situation is very particular, who actually want to write in English because they perceive power as being there. And it's not necessarily the language that they work in. I was talking to a young, aspiring Finnish author a few weeks ago who is writing a novel set in the Czech Republic. And she's based in Finland, Finnish is her first language, and she wants to write it in English. And I said to her, her English is very good, but her Finnish is better. And I said, why do you want to do this? And she said, well, I'm worried that it wouldn't be read in the Czech Republic if I didn't write it in English. That was one answer. And the other one was, she said, I want to be read. She didn't want to be, as she perceived it, trapped in a small language. And I find that a problematical and a dangerous situation. I think one of the richnesses of the world is the varieties of language that we have. And there's good and bad in globalization. There's good and bad in staying in one locale. But I think we have to box clever. We have to duck and dive in this matter to produce the best work we can as writers in the cultural complexities in which we find ourselves. And I think, although most of the time I'm just trying to work out what my character is doing in the next chapter, whether they choose tea or coffee with breakfast that morning, I'm dealing with mundane details. The bigger picture is sometimes that negotiation. If I've got a minute, I'll finish with a poem, if I may. A Welsh writer who's probably thought of as an English writer because he was a professor in Cambridge for most of his career. And he's got a book called People of the Black Mountains. It's the area that he's from. And his first novel was called Border Country, about that area. And I was commissioned recently to write some poems about some ecological work trying to preserve burn damage on the mountains, in the Black Mountains. And a friend of mine said to me, why are we attracted to these upland areas? Why are we attracted to these areas that are on the borders between things? And it struck me that the border here is a much broader idea, going way beyond the idea of nation now. It's the border between cultivated and uncultivated, between habitable and inhabitable, between earth and air when you're on the top of a mountain, and between the physical and the spiritual. And it occurred to me that edges are places where meanings occur. And the word definition in English contains the idea of an edge, a fin. The Welsh word for definition is diffiniad, and the word fin in Welsh means an edge or a border. So this is a poem called Borderland. And you need to know for this that fin is the Welsh word for a border. It's inside the word diffiniad. And there's a place in the Black Mountains called Capel y Ffin, which means the chapel on the border. And you can see I'm not merely thinking of borders of nations in this poem. And I'll finish with this. You'll find a ffin inside each definition. We see what is when we see what it's not. Edges are where meanings happen. On the black whaleback of this mountain, earth curves away so sky can start to show a ffins a kind of definition, where skylarks climb across earth's turn to air, and pulsing muscle turns to an artful song, the edge that lets a meaning happen. Live rock can yield to mortared stone, a city to a castle, then a shepherd's hut, where ffins contained inside a definition, where the lithic turns into the human. Here's where things fall together, not apart, at edges that let meanings happen. And self here blurs into annihilation, Larkfall, earthfall, skyfall, manfall, each create the fiend that is the place of definition, the edges where we see our meanings happen.
I find it frustrating that generally to be English is perceived to be the upper class of Downton Abbey. To be English is perceived to be at least middle class. To be English is perceived to be the colonizer. I'm not that, and neither are most white working class English, let alone the hundreds of thousands of immigrant English.
I suppose it's interesting that the kind of the feeling of almost frustration with what nationality is, and the kind of almost it's something that's made after the event and after the fact, and it's something that's
stamped upon us. I mean, we both spent years in New Zealand. For me, because I left New Zealand when I was 23, and because New Zealand is a small country that gets a bit annoyed when you leave. You know, small countries do that, right? How dare you go away? I wasn't welcome back for a book festival until I'd been longlisted for the Orange Prize. Then I was really welcome.
book festival is shallow.
So that was a nationhood stamped on me by them. When I left, I was just an English girl going home. When I was nearly winning a prize, I was a New Zealand girl going home. Other people do it to us. I don't feel like I do it to myself. People stamp nationality on us.
And Jared, that sense of being a Northern Irish writer, with I guess in a region that's between the two cultures of Ireland and the UK, and kind of having its own, trying to get its own kind of unique perspective.
Yeah, it's that idea of stamping nationality upon you. With the Good Friday Agreement, we were told we could have a dual nationality and be both Irish, Northern Irish, now, and British. And I think it's led to a very fragmented sort of idea of nationality and a fragmented psyche in the North. I was talking to Arthur just earlier, saying that I'm from a nation, Northern Ireland, which is apparently different from the south of Ireland, and it is in its ways, but there's the same sort of common ground as well there, as it is with Britishness. But I think the North is an exceptional case of having ideas and constructs sort of stamped upon it, and it's left a lot of damage and confusion, these ideas of nationality. You see with the conflict that's been there. It still goes on, that trauma. So for me, it's a very unhealthy thing.
And I guess, in a sense, did people respond to that, you know, being given, being allowed to have a dual nationality? Did people respond to it in a kind of positive way, or did they kind of view it as something that was...
Well, it's still, as I say, it's still very much sort of a polar opposites there, you know. But a lot of people are sort of starting to begin to integrate both of these things, or both sides of a sort of schizoid personality or national identity. I have two passports and two different names on the passports, one in Irish and one in English spelling. So you can embrace both. And with the languages again, Irish and English, I've embraced both and tried to create some type of new forms and idioms from that, integrating both. So there's positives and negatives to do with it.
Well, it's interesting because I was looking back at the other discussions, and Tahir Benjaloun, who's in Jaipur, but he's a French Arabic writer, said that he can neither say he's Arabic or French, because if he's one, the other side will complain that he's not the other. And so there's kind of, you cannot define yourself either way, you're left.
Well, I like sort of the idea of Diogenes again, who lived in I thought he lived in a barrel. It was a barrel, but Bruce Lee was also asked one time, did he consider himself American or Chinese? And he said he considered himself human first, and an artist second. So it's where I would sort of place myself as well.
And Rashida, as I guess here in Brussels, in Belgium, you know, the concept of the nation state and nationality is something that is, to say the least, problematic.
Yeah, it's very complex. It's the least that you can say about it, and I recognize what you're talking about when you talk about that double nationality. I'm originally from Morocco. I was born in Morocco, and as a Moroccan, I can never lose my Moroccan nationality. So there is no way that you can say I will throw that away and become, for instance, just a Belgian or a European. That's so you're ad eternum Moroccan, and I am also Belgian, but the fact that you have that double nationality is problematic, because what we have here in this country, for instance, the society that receives migrants is very demanding and asks full loyalty. So that means that you have to choose. You're either one of them, or you're either you will stay the foreigner. And that double nationality is problematic. So it makes you suspicious, because you don't make that choice to become fully a Belgian. But the problem is that even if you had the choice to in fact choose one nationality, you're not perceived as being one of the natives, if I may say so, because we're still thinking very much in ethnic criteria. So if you're not white and original from Europe, then you can never be 100% one party. In Belgium, a nationalistic party who has that idea of dividing up the people living in this country, telling, promoting the idea that there is a group of citizens who are autochthones, who are those who are born here, are from the soil, and are the ones who have, in fact, the most to say in this place in the world. They are the ones who have the most, how to say, historically, they have the right to call themselves Flemish. And you have that new idea that they say, well, but we can expand a bit our world to newcomers. They can be part of our society. They can be new citizens, but they will never become citizens at the same level as the autochthones. So that division is very, very strong here in this country. Yeah.
And I guess going back to what Kapka says about your national identity being what you call home, but what you personally call home. For you coming from Morocco but living in Belgium, do you still call, would you call Morocco home, or would you call Belgium home, or would you say that actually they're both my homes? They're the two places that I'm now essentially spiritually connected to?
Well, I think home is in fact where you feel good and where you have people that understand you and where you can be yourself. And it can be anywhere where you feel at your place and where you feel accepted and where you feel you are understood and where you have the feeling that you can do the things that you really want to do, and where you have the feeling that you have that the things that you do have a meaning, are meaning something to someone. So that is for me home, and it's very one of the most annoying questions is yeah, what are you in fact? Are you Moroccan or are you Belgian? It's a question that it's not you cannot answer it with either that answer or it's very complex, and you let people be themselves and be in first instance humans and artists and mothers, and identity is so complex and it's also very dynamic. I'm not the person I was 10 years ago, and I will change in 10 years from now, so it's very difficult to say, well, that's me, that's the person I am. I'm changing, and that's what identity is in fact.
Like Kapka's Nation of Poets, we've felt understood. I would like to open up the floor to some questions for this section. There should be a roving mic.
I think of everything to do with class. It's the first thing I see. Or possibly I see that I'm a woman. And I mean, the thing, what was it? I made a note about Peter Brook. doing world theatre and the Indian Company doing ethnic theatre. Mike Lee writes a play about a family and it's called Universal. Any woman writes a play about a family and it's called Domestic. It's the same thing. So I perceive myself as a person from my class. Of course, I would be lying to say that I'm not Julie Birchall. I'm not saying I'm living in a working class life now. Of course I'm not. I grew up working class. Many of my siblings, I'm the youngest of 7, are still part of that world. I now live in the world of the arts, which is generally middle class. I perceive myself an outsider here. But we're all outsiders in some way. You know, no one belongs. People talk about the writers not belonging. No one. You ask anyone how they felt at 14. No one understands belonging. So do I see class first? Yes. But I see gender as well, because to me they are the major disparities that still exist across our societies, not just in the West, everywhere. It's massive. And we can say that we're doing pretty well in the first world, but when women, when there's 10 plays on at the National Theatre and only one's by a woman, the National Theatre of Great Britain, you know, when we still see constantly that we are only getting Oxbridge graduates doing stuff in Britain, it's not good enough. We're still not there, and we've got a long, long way to go. And I think that questions of nationality matter to me enormously. But I've yet to come across a nation that isn't riven with class. And I grew up in New Zealand, which likes to call itself not classist, but believe me, it is. It's vital. I see D.H. Lawrence as a working class writer. I don't see him as an English writer. And I certainly don't see him as British. So.
A question there from the gentleman.
Well, my family came from Ireland. I work in Belgium and I travel around. It's the language issue that interests me. It's fascinating as you travel around. Obviously, people speak to me because they seem to know where I come from. Wales fascinates me because they are hidebound by this idea that their language is absolutely the root of their nationality. You travel around Europe, we've got 27 languages, which I sit on one of the committees, so 27 languages which we translate into 27 different combinations. We spend a fortune on that. But I feel actually no problem about speaking English. But a lot of people seem to think that to speak English is a real problem. They lose their identity. Now, it might be just because I wear a kilt that I don't feel that I've lost that identity. But two things happen. One, I don't feel that we've lost anything by speaking English, although I do speak Doric as well when I'm at home, obviously. And by the way, I'm sorry, I run a forestry company in the north of Scotland, and yeah, it's my fault. I'm chopping your trees down. But I'll speak to you later. I'll speak to you later about it. We also plan it. The thing that always strikes me is, as you travel around Europe, people are absolutely delighted that you show national identity. Now, it might be a pretty obvious way of doing it, but what I keep asking myself is, why is it that if people are so concerned that they are losing their identity, why is it that we all do dress the same? Why do we all come down to this jeans and ganzis and tops, and it's not because some of us are wearing jeans and ganzis, but you know, if there is identity, what are we scared to losing? What is it that we've scared we've lost? And if we are so scared we've lost it, why are we not doing something about it? And I will continue to wear the kilt, and I've worn it since I was 8, and I just, it's not the same kilt when I see it.
The language is an identifier of identity. It has been supremely important because it is the one thing that's been there for a long time. And the earliest Welsh poem, as many Welsh scholars will tell you, is 1500 years old. And you know, I can recite a bit of it now if you really want me to. And you know, it's recognizable. It's recognizably Welsh. What they don't tell you is it was actually probably written either in the north of England or the south of Scotland, because people spoke Welsh there at that time. Welsh was spoken in southern Scotland until the 9th, maybe the 10th century. identities are complex and they flow around, and language areas move around as well. But it's been very important because for some peculiar set of historical circumstances, in spite of the fact that we've been tucked into the crook of England's elbow for so many years, actually people have carried on speaking Welsh, and only Welsh actually, until well into the late 19th century. And it's only well into the 19th century that the Welsh in large numbers started to speak English. And that's the reason why it's been such an identifier of identity. It's particularly what other people have noticed. Even Queen Catherine, the widow of Henry V, who is so loved in France nowadays, the widow of Henry V, whose lover was Owain Tudur, a Welshman. The chronicles talk about how she was delighted that Owain's friends from Wales couldn't speak either French or English, whereas Owain spoke to her. He could seduce her because he could speak French as well as he could speak Welsh, I think. It's been an identifier for a long time. The situation now is that 20% of the population of Wales speak Welsh. The language is still in very small degree of decline, may be arrested. But I believe it's very important for it to keep going. I mean, I was brought up not speaking Welsh and learned it in rather like Capca learning English. I learned Welsh in my late teens, maybe a bit too late for it to be the main language that I write in, but I do write in Welsh and I translate Welsh as well, and it continues to play a vital part in the cultural fabric of that particular area, and some other places too, in some other parts of the world. So it's historically significant because for some strange reason it's continued in ways that Gaelic and Irish, even Irish, which is strong in some ways, haven't. And it often surprises me that Welsh is regarded as a great success story among languages that have been under pressure. And if that's a success story, boy, I'm worried about the others.
I think there's an interesting. Sorry, what's to say something? There's an interesting divide. I think there's an issue between the relationship of languages and how they relate with each other and how they compete, and whether they are being then other languages are being lost. But also, I think there's another argument here about things that aren't being represented in terms of class and gender and nationality. And I guess the question from on the floor was how, if these are being lost or if these are being not represented, how do we then what can we do anything about it? Does any is there a role for the writer to?
Yeah, write about them. My novel, The Room of Lost Things, is set in South London, where I live. Several people, like in big interviews and stuff, said to me, "Oh, you were tricking with us, weren't you? Didn't realise till chapter 5 that Claire was black." And I went, "When did you realise that Robert was white?" I wrote characters where that it is revealed what race they are, if that's, or ethnicity, when it was relevant to the story. I wasn't tricking with anybody. People were assuming that as a white woman, even though I was writing about Brixton, I was writing only white characters. That was their racism, putting it onto me. We fix this by putting everyone in our work when it's relevant, not because we're just throwing them all in, but we fix it by having not just stuff about nice white middle-class people having a chat over a dinner party. Sometimes people have a chat over a dinner party who aren't nice and white. Well, they might be nice, but there might be other colours. I mean, so we change it by peopling our novels, and I have done this with my historical novels, with everybody, by representing the true world, not just the one that the arts tends to. We have this terrible mirror in the arts. The review programs all look the same, and then people write the thing that looks the same, and then they do it back, and it just does this. We can do better, so we might need to risk getting it wrong. Mm-hmm. I did an interview just 2 days ago for The Independent on Sunday with Julia Crouch, crime writer, who is a heterosexual woman who's written a gay protagonist, a lesbian protagonist. And as a gay woman, I was asked, did I think that was wrong? Well, of course I don't think it's wrong. I'd rather somebody, rather it wasn't just us having to fly the flag all the time. I think we make it better by peopling our worlds truly.
And what Chris picked up about small languages, or smaller languages, and I'm not sure, yes, I think it's true that smaller languages tend to be swamped by larger languages, and I think if a language is a marker of a culture, then we should worry that smaller cultures are swamped by larger cultures. As someone who comes from a small language, Bulgarian is spoken by about 8 million people, 20% of whom live abroad. That's an aside. In terms of language, as someone who has also translated, I translate from Bulgarian into English when there is an opportunity, which isn't very often, which is exactly the problem. I can say that it's not a problem of smaller languages versus large languages or cultures. It's a problem of the traffic and who is ensuring that there is enough traffic both ways. For example, if you're an English language writer, it's much easier to be translated into other languages. Speaking to, for example, an Argentinian publisher once, 40% of what is published in Argentina, and this is Spanish, which is the second largest language already, is in translation. In Britain, I think it's 5% of what is published is in translation. So there is a real, or essentially three. Oh God.
It's fiction, but it's 3% overall.
Oh, thank you. That's really depressed me now. But yes, it's a very, very, very sort of shamefully low percentage. So I think there is a problem of inequality of traffic. And I think that is the task of publishers and the media to kind of open up more doors, because I think there is interest in smaller languages, in literature from smaller languages. Look at the explosion of crime fiction from Scandinavia. Mm-hmm. I was reviewing a new novel the other week by a new British writer, Antia Nicholson. It's just out now, and it's set in Georgia during communist times. And when I was sort of looking up the background of Georgian literature, I realized I'd never read a book by a Georgian writer, and I wished I had, and I was looking for some to read, after that novel, which is essentially an outsider's view, brilliant novel. And I thought, I want to read something by a Georgian writer. Nothing is available in English. Nothing except, 18th century religious literature. And I think that is something that needs to be discussed, in places like this. Yeah.
But into the going from other languages into English, it's something that's known, but is there a reason why going the other way into other languages, like your example of the Argentina, why are they choosing English language novels? Why aren't they choosing French? Time's ever, it's moving on. I'd like to hand over to Rashida to give her talk, and then we'll have another round of responses.
Taken seriously if they wrote in French. Only Nobel Prize winner for literature said, for instance, that the Dutch language was un causement de grenouilles mis en grammaire. Or in plain English, the croaking of frogs put into grammar. Of course, Maeterlinck wrote in French. Conscience defended the importance of the Dutch language through his literature and played a major role in promoting the idea of a Flemish people. He adhered to the idea that language is the whole of the people. And those who read him began imagining a nation for that Dutch-speaking people. Unfortunately, it is that very idea that divides today our country. Conscience's legacy became an important symbol of the Flemish movement, a movement which at its worst was not afraid to go in alliance with Nazism and racism. So you can understand that I was unenthusiastic towards the kind of national literature that Conscience represented, because it was too often used to define a rigid notion of people and of citizens. It was used to justify a politics of exclusion, and it caused an obsession with identity. Referring to a national literature was, in my eyes, referring to something archaic and closed, a monolith that would not change even if the world was changing. I felt more comfortable with Ben Okri, who said, "I was born in the world, and I'm at home in the world's myths." So, when I was asked to say something about the meaning of conscience for me as a writer who came in the 70s with my parents from the north of Morocco to this brave new country, it was that idea of an almost hostile national literature that dominated my thoughts. A national literature that I could not touch or add something to it, for it left no room for other stories, because these other stories were simply not considered to be part of the national patrimony, and they weren't considered to be part of the collective narrative. Sure, these other stories could be very interesting and informative, but they remained the stories of the others, stories from the periphery, who could never affect or alter what was considered as the center of and the norm. As Mark Kloostermans, a book reviewer of one of the two important Flemish newspapers, puts it plainly, sure, we like to read allochthonious writers, but only if they meet our criteria and if they make bold statements we secretly enjoy. Here you have it. There is even a word to describe writers like me. I'm considered to be a special kind of writer. I am called an allochthone writer. Let me explain to you what that word means, because there is no equivalent for it in English. It sounds unfriendly. I can assure you it is unfriendly. The word allochthone has a Greek origin and means someone who came from elsewhere, in opposite to the word autochthone, which is used to indicate the Flemish people and means pure, came from the land. The reality in this society is that there is a semantic division on the grounds of ethnic origin. You either are an allochthone, from the outside, or an autochthone, from the land. The only chance to get rid of that allochthone label in this part of the world is to be a brilliant soccer player who leads the national team to victory and fame. Guess it's too late for me to make a career in soccer. And so for writers like me, it's not obvious to just be part of that great guild of writers, of Dutch writers. Regardless of the fact that I write in Dutch, my writing is not considered to meet the norm, and the norm that has been set out by the center. I write about identity, about migration, and a changing, super diverse world. That is the kind of world we live in today here in this country. And yet, some readers and critics are convinced that my literature has nothing to do with them. It is the literature of the others, as opposed to national literature. I write about Antwerp, and readers would talk to me about my work as if I had described a world far away from them. My characters are strange, exotic individuals for the mere fact that their names are Yunus, Mariam, and Marwan, and not Isabel, Jan, or Peter. I'm not so very young anymore, but I'm still very naive, and I thank God for that. That's why I decided to challenge myself for my lecture about conscience. I wanted to emphasize the things we had in common. I wanted to draw a line between Conscience's writing then at his time and in his troubled society where his language was not recognized, and me writing today in my society which has transformed to a place where you can see the world. In Antwerp, Brussels and Ghent alone you have over 170 different nationalities living together, and these people brought their languages, their stories and their convictions to this country. For me, the main question was how the dominant society reacts upon claims of recognition of one's own cultural identity. I think that the way society responds to those claims can tell us a lot about how that society defines itself and how self-confident that society is in a changing world. I had the brilliant idea, so I thought, to make a comparison between Conscience's striving for recognition and the aspiration to cultural emancipation of the new minorities in Belgium. I wanted to show how literature could be of help when you are trying to form an identity and trying to define your place in the world. I tried to connect the search for identity of young citizens with non-European roots and Conscience's cultural and linguistical struggle. I was convinced that in his time, Conscience asked himself the same questions as do these young men and women who live today in the big cities of this country. Questions like, who am I, where do I belong to, what is home, and what does language mean to me? And then, of course, I went too far. I crossed the line. I came too close. I asked my audience what Conscience would think of Diab Abu Jaja, the former leader of the demonized organization, the AEL, the Arab European League, which advocated for the emancipation of the Arabs in Europe and Belgium. Jaja launched the provocative idea to make Arabic one of the national languages of this country. My audience, mainly white and middle class, was not amused, I can assure you. That idea encountered resistance in the audience because there was that fear that their constructed national identity, a Flemish identity, which has been obtained after a hard battle, would be transformed by multicultural, non-Flemish compatriots into something else. I could see the horror in the eyes of my audience, and it is also that fear that makes it difficult to really open up to other stories, to let those stories really change ideas, opinions, and the way we look at things. As long as they don't get too close and risk changing the norm, then these stories are okay. But for how long can a society shut out its own reality? Not for very long, because it's banging at the door. In fact, this evening I declined an invitation to a funeral in the city of Ghent. It's some 50 kilometers from Brussels. It is the funeral of a word. The city of Ghent decided, on the instigation of a few organizations and artists, not to use the word allochthone anymore. And at this very moment, on the International Day Against Racism, there is in the town hall of Ghent a funeral ceremony going on. And when the word is buried, there will be an enormous feast. Perhaps we could all, after this, take the train and join the people of Ghent for this celebration of the semantic birth of citizens. History is made by people who have a lot of imaginations. Thank you.
Many campaigns and political lobbying to pass an Irish Language Act. And even if an Irish Language Act was passed, the final step of that is the signature of the Queen of England. So I'll read some poems which deal with some of the issues we've been talking about. Aistrachan. Ní aistrachan a cluisi sibh an acht a carja. Mé aistrithe, achrithe, is cialaithe, le hiisce éirithe an bhéirle. A dhéanad límanáid thuúlainneach, dín dearag ma chud filiíochta. Ní bheith mé aistrithe an acht. I mean like catige an bhfuil mé seo ar chorbí. An agur seo an fashion asúra, an leo da hangach, poetry as gilige. An agur bhfuil an síl a gachrú, ní féidir a bheith cinse. Amani, iríonn tú tuirseach, de clús sa falsa éireannacha, fion sasú an monoglat a dearlat. It sounds lovely. I wish I had the Irish. Can't you do the translation? Iad, ag stanú orm, go mór thualach, mar a stanú ar aon cór a churann mí compar de cinneal ortha. Iad sásta go bhfuil sé hart, sásta go an fila burla ag teachta mí é, le coppla scéal grin. Agus seo é an é siogin, lena codge caintse ar cafe culture. Seo é le crochú dífa go bhfuil siad lehan aganta is cultartha, is go dtigann siad an pictar mór, go dtigann siad filiíocht, seo an éis é agus sin mise an siúd hál a mianar. A gcóirneal ma grúma, ag stanú go héadbar, olta ar aon rúm a codge filiíochta, ma codge filiíochta géalaige, nar hig Enya. Translation. Tonight, my friends, there will be no translation. Nothing translated, altered, diluted with hub-bubbly English that turns the red wine of my poem into Coca-Cola. Tonight, there will be no translation. You see, what I'm saying is, what am I doing here? Is this just another fashion, a fad, the bilingual reading, poetry, talk of Gaelic? Has the world gone crazy? Sometimes you get tired of talking to lazy Irish ears, tired of the monoglot who says, it sounds lovely. I wish I had the Irish. Don't you do translations? There they are, gawping at me, wide-eyed, like I'm some kind of oddball, just rolled out of Lingoland, making them all uneasy. How glad they'll be when this is over. Glad that the English poet is up next, with some jokes to smooth over this hitch in the evening. And here he is, with his talk of cafe culture and of Seamus. Here he is to prove to them that they are witty, broad-minded, and cultured, that they get the gist of this poetry thing that tops and tails this evening. Here he is, and there's me in the corner, alone, dejected, gawping, wide-eyed, drunk on the red wine of my poetry, my Irish poetry that no one understood. Translations. We were stoned, watching the lunchtime news on the bar TV. Outside, the rain falling down like blues again. Always rain. Over the weekend, there had been another spate of random attacks. A family of Poles were burnt out of Ballysullen. A Czech was attacked with a baseball bat, and Latvians were sacked from a slave farm in Tyrone. A Romanian girl had lost her feet in the cold. The Filipinos had held a White Line protest, and 2 Fenians were kicked up and down Sandy Row. The TV experts said that pre-existing sectarian mindsets had facilitated or translated into anti-immigrant or racist sentiment. Petra, the pretty Czech, said she didn't like the Poles. They come here and they take all the jobs, said Petra. The Poles are okay, said Joe. Leave the fucking Poles alone, man. At least they're not Protestants. The American tourists got up and left after just 1 drink. They thought we were all crazy Irish. I wanted to go home, but I was home. Outside, the rain, falling down like blues again. Always rain. You can always depend on the rain. Changa. Ismisha and Changa. Ismisha and Changa amala and uadahura lippy fuchel isnahajas kosa e kikkel. Ismisha and Changa shincha or ward and wistra and nifiki realtish gega kanglcha. Corp brish de brucha. Currafi cloher or cool clear of raku and lay. Ismisha and Changa. I am the tongue. I am the tongue in the kidnapper's sack, lips-stitched, feet flailing. I am the tongue bound on the butcher's block in government offices, a battered, broken corpse ditched at dawn, Ismisha and Changa. I am the tongue. Misha and Changa a fillins and ihe kjolti she, Mickey me ow, snawam trina kalbli avlisha, kjolam os ishul a vilma de mulligain or de habla, etchriam trina pashasti du gorcha runda fin kahar vrishta, Ismisha and Changa. I am the tongue. I am the tongue who comes in the night. I am Jinx swimming through flax and electricity cables. I sing softly in the filament of the bulb on your table. I am Johnny Dark and Creole. I wing through secret pitch black passageways beneath the broken city. Ismisha and Changa. I am the tongue. Ismisha and Changa a chiachni antu. Or na boithra daracha, a dawarni, creedu. Falamort fin lampas raja buig and corneal. Lanam de lorag mar lanan jultiha. Ismisha and Changa a hostitu. Or hame a bokadu and illa kor a manin jerka. Ismisha and Changa. I am the tongue. I am the tongue you shun on dark roads, in pubs. I am hoodoo, waiting for you on the corner under the yellow street lamp, stalking you like a jilted John. Ismisha and Changa. I am the tongue you silence, Ismisha and Changa. I am Patwa, I am Mumbo, Jumbo, Juju, Ismisha and Changa. I am a mojo of words, Ismisha and Changa. I am a mojo of words in the back pocket of the weirdo poet busking for bursaries. Carmagh.
Kia ora. Kia ora tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te Stella Duffy o. Kei te Stella Duffy o. Nā wai, ko Thames e Waikato. Nā awa, ko Thames e Waikato. Nā monga, kei Denmark Hill e Pohaturoa. I grew up in New Zealand. I grew up where the people who were the colonised and oppressed spoke their own language still.
I grew up where the people who were made to feel outside knew that the land was theirs and the land spoke to them. I was enormously privileged to be a 5-year-old white working class South London girl and moved to a small town in New Zealand that was 70, maybe 75% Māori, Cook Island Māori, Samoan, Niuean, Tongan, Swedish, Dutch, blah, 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 but 70% brown. Multicultural before that was trendy. It was 1968, and it was a huge gift to somebody who was going to become a novelist. If anybody sees this who knows better than me when you're filming it, yeah, my Maori's rubbish. It is, it's rubbish, but I've got a few of the things in the right place and my pronunciation's good. I care about that enormously. I was an English girl who, because I was English, was assumed to be middle class and posh, was bullied because of that. Because I was an incomer, and I was bullied because my South London accent meant that I must have been posh. And it was enormous to grow up in cultures that did not have, this is a writing event. I grew up in cultures that were oral cultures. Māori didn't write itself down until the white people came. I call myself not English or New Zealand, but a Pākehā New Zealander. Pākehā is New Zealand Māori for white, other. And I'm a Londoner, I'm a Pākehā Londoner. London is where I come from, not England or Britain, London. I was born literally within the sound of the river. Before the Thames barrier was put up, from our council block you could see ships going up the river, and you could still see St Paul's, just the tip of it, but you could. My mother was a Londoner. If I were Irish, if I were American like the Americans you mentioned earlier, I would say I was Irish, because it's the grandparents and the great-grandparents, but I'm a Londoner enough to know that that would be inappropriate. Nationhood is huge to me, of course, because of having grown up in both places. A London mother and a New Zealand father who lived in London for 25 years post-war, who brought up London children, and an English mother who had the guts at 48 to sell everything, and they didn't own anything, they were in a council house, sell all their property, all their furniture, and go to New Zealand because her husband hadn't seen his parents since his father had died, since just after the war. And it was on a ship, and our ship did this. Let me see if I can get the map right for you. It left Southampton Harbour, and it came down here. Am I going the right way? Maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but I'm going to do it anyway. And it came this way around Curacao, Trinidad and Tobago, came through the Panama Canal, and my parents said, I was 5. I remember it because they said, it's so important. It's a miracle of engineering. And then it came down here, and we went to Fiji, we went to Tahiti, and we came down the side of New Zealand, and the North Island of New Zealand is shaped like that. Pointy there, and we came down like this. My dad, who'd been a prisoner of war in Germany for 4.5 years, because he was a good old socialist, he wanted to fight fascism, said, you see that? My father, who didn't cry when I came out, who only cried when I told him I was going to be an actor, not a lawyer. What was I doing wasting that education? My father had tears in his eyes, and he said, I never thought I'd see that again. To me, that was nationhood. My dad going to the land. My mum missing the Thames, that was nationhood. My mother, who was a South London girl who had to leave school at 14, even though she got into the grammar school is where you go to get a better education because they couldn't afford the uniform. It was 1935, she was the oldest of her family. My mother, who had to go and get a seamstress's apprenticeship, could quote screeds of poetry by heart. To her, quoting Wordsworth and Shakespeare, even though she left school at 14 with no exams, that was her nation. To my dad, the land and the sea, the Pacific that goes like that, and the Thames that goes like that, and I've only ever seen it when I've been on the west coast of Scotland, and it's that wild, in this part of the world I mean. I've never seen sea so wild until you go right up to the north of Scotland. That's nationhood. Yes, it can be in language, and yes, it can be in story, but where I grew up, people sung it and they talked it. And to say that where you're from in Māori, which I took in because I was very privileged to grow up in a community that had so many Māori who were trying desperately to get back their language in the same way that Wales has done, and I totally applaud that, because we are nothing if we don't pass on from language. So to me, yes, I feel like an idiot. I only speak one. Sorry. I speak to you and I'm speaking in English and you're not from there. How amazing, you know? I feel a bit thick that I only speak English. But yes, I understand that it's a useful language, but where I grew up, people passed on in story. And so in Māori, you would say, I'm Stella Duffy, kei te Stella Duffy o. Ko Thames e Waikato, na awa. The Thames and the Waikato are my rivers. Ko Denmark Hill e Pohaturoa na Monga. Denmark Hill, where I live in London, and Pohaturoa, the largest hill near where I grew up in Tokoroa, New Zealand, are my mountains. In Māori, you name yourself by saying your land and your water, because it's not about the border, it's just about the village. It's about your closest thing. And it's about taking the guts of it. If there's not land and there's not water, there's nothing. You don't have to own it. You don't have to claim a stake to it. You don't have to put a kitsch flag on it. It's small and it's poignant and it's enormous. And what I've got out of this discussion tonight is how privileged I am as a white working class girl to have grown up in both of those cultures. How enormously fortunate I am that my parents' accident of poverty took me to a small town in New Zealand and gave me that. And the other thing is, we were talking about old films earlier. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There is no place like home. Dorothy is not saying, take me home. Dorothy is saying there is no place like home. It's what we make it. And I want to welcome everyone to my home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for your brilliant contributions. I think the thing that's I feel is coming out of all the discussions and how how personal home is and how personal identity is, and how, I guess, what the role of you all, I'm about to give you your roles in life, is as a writer, your role is to continually be kind of highlighting that personal and highlighting that kind of, it's, you know, that you said that nobody belongs. Writers are in exile, but everyone is disconnected, and it's up to the writer to then highlight that everybody is of that same person. No identity is the same. And I guess if that is true, and I believe, and I think it's true, what is, you know, going back to what Kapka said, a national literature, ? Can that exist, or is that just a false creation?
I think
Scary
anything
question,
that says a national literature, it does go back to the times of empire. All the empires, you know. This nation had an empire too. The British like to think of themselves as the only ones who had an empire, but a lot of European big countries had empires. And you could put a stamp on it, maybe. I doubt, had anyone asked Thomas Hardy if he thought he was writing for Britain, he'd have said yes. I think he was pretty regional, actually. But the idea that you could say it was a whole one homogenous thing, it's certainly never been true of Britain. It's never been true. Last week I was in Newcastle, next week I'm in Manchester. You couldn't get more regionally different places. You know, I don't perceive there to be anything British specifically other than geography. And I think anything else has been imposed. And the minute you go to those regions in Britain, those people will tell you the same.
And Jared, the poem you talked about there, kind of highlights the battle of having to be translated. Do you feel, you talked earlier today about how there is the writing that is personal for you and there's the writing that is public. Do you feel a sense of responsibility as your role as a writer, which kind of gives you a capital W, to fight that battle for the language and for the non-translation of what you do?
Maybe I did when I was younger, but not now. But the idea, just that national literature idea again. Tomorrow I'm going to Galway when I arrive back in Dublin for an Irish language literature festival, which will be purely through the medium of Irish.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the nation wouldn't be able to read any of this stuff. But to me that's part of the national literature, if there is such a thing. But most of the nation couldn't read it, so it is an absurd concept, especially so in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
And so do you feel that your kind of work has to be highlighting that kind of that conundrum of you want to write in Irish but you would only get heard if you translate it?
Those poems that I read, I wrote those maybe 12, 13 years ago, and that's how I felt back then.
Mm-hmm.
But it's changed and developed over the years, so the last, because looking at sort of some of the absurdities even of the earlier stuff that I wrote myself,
mm-hmm.
and sort of being self-parodying, so it just develops as you go along.
Mm. I know, because Arthur, you said at the beginning that in response to Kafka that Irish writers were always trying to define their identity, but they're defining it from when they started writing in English.
Yes, and I think that's quite important. And as you were saying, Kafka, about nation states being a relatively new thing, and were in themselves partly a fiction, and so that was when certainly in the 19th and early 20th century, the nationalist movement in Ireland and the literary movement went hand in hand, mm-hmm. and I guess it is part of it's a little different with colonizers and with colonized that it becomes imperative on the colonized to assert an identity, I guess. And I think that's why it's been such an important part of certainly of Irish literature in English.
I guess Rashida, for you, I guess the interesting thing that comes out of your talk is that taking that comparison to where Flemish was and how it was a marginalised language, and the fact that to a sense national identity is forgetful. We talked about it being something that's historic, but it has also forgotten its history in a sense.
I think it's important to know one's history. It's very important to understand also what's going on today also. And when I talk about when I describe the history that Flemish talking in this country have had, it can explain today the obsession that Flemish people have now with language and with identity, and how scared they are of losing what they have achieved in a way, and that makes them very closed also for everything that is not Flemish and everything that is not belonging to that history that they cherish and that they feel they have to protect in every way, and that makes it difficult for people who bring their own language, bring their own history and their own stories to this country, to be fully accepted and to be part of this new society that is changing and that is becoming obviously something totally different. Today on the radio, for instance, they had there was an scientific research that has been done in Brussels, and they have discovered that, or they came to the to the fact that the Arabic language was the fourth important language in Brussels. You had French, Flemish, and English, and fourth language was Arabic. And everyone that was asked on the radio of their opinion to that fact, because it's just a fact, there was great panic. And there was, how can we deal with this? Because it's like a threat, you know. And you had our Minister of Education who was proposing to make English the third national language of Belgium, just to avoid that Arabic would stand up and be how to say recognized as a language that could be used in Belgium. I think that fear is a bit paranoia, because you deal with changing society. You cannot say, we don't like it. It's just a fact, and you have to learn to integrate it in your society. And that's the only way to deal with changing, I think.
And just talk a bit further about it, with that information, with that kind of those stats that came out for that Arabic community. Was there information of was Arabic their only language, or were they Arabic and French or Arabic and Flemish, or was that not something that's known?
I don't think that I have understood your question.
I guess were they solely Arabic speakers, or were they, because I was interested in the idea of there are the four kind of top four languages, but whether particularly for the Arabic speakers, whether that was their own language, or were they speaking French and Dutch, or?
Well, I suppose that they examined the situation in Brussels, and I think what they have examined it was people who used the Arabic language in their homes and in their private situation. Obviously, if you live in Brussels, you have to use, of course, either Dutch or French to communicate and to make yourself understandable in the public, in the outside world. So I guess it's a combination of several languages, but that's the reality. And I think it's a pity that that kind of diversity is still seen as a threat. And in my opinion, that kind of diversity is just one, it's a reality, and two, it can open up opportunities, it can create new chances, it can create new possibilities, and that we don't see because we carry with us that very difficult history, and everything that has to do with language put forward as the only, how to say, vehicle of culture and identity.
It's interesting because for me, one of the most exciting things about Brussels and Belgium is the multilingualism. From having grown up in Scotland, where the difference of me being English and growing up in Scotland was a huge issue. But to come here and to Brussels, everyone is from somewhere else, which is kind of remarkably refreshing, and that kind of linguistic kind of interaction and diversity. It's just kind of, so it's interesting to see that it's still even though there is still the threat as well. So we'll start with the gentleman over there, and then we'll see.
It's done, is allowed a lot of European traditions to re-emerge and to establish themselves. And I think the nationality or language is probably secondary, because in my view, Tolstoy reads just as well in English as it probably does in Russian. And I come from myself from another old Irish tradition, what we call Anglo-Irish, which produced many literary giants stretching from Dean Swift through Oscar Wilde and Goldsmith through to Yeats. I think William Trevor is probably the only current Anglo-Irish writer, but that's very much a tradition. It's just as much Irish as anything else, but it's not the only definition of Irish by any possible means. But I think it's a tradition rather than a nation. So I just feel that we need to look at traditions as much as well.
And the question, gentleman here.
Well, I suppose the question is that when we were talking about nationality, there was lots of discussion about that there wasn't a very if we got stuck in the idea of a nation state, that was too restrictive. And nationality meant very different things, it was very personal and that. But as soon as we asked about a national literature, we went straight back to the nation state. Why does an idea of a national literature have to be any as restrictive as an idea of nation either? Why isn't, like in Ireland where we've got literature in the Irish language, we've got the Anglo-Irish that founded much of what we consider the stalwarts of Irish literature, and then we have sort of more rural Paddy Kavanagh and all those other people. Why isn't that all part of a loose national literature? Maybe it is the idea of tradition rather than it being something restricted that's just something that's absolutely Irish. Is it not something that moves across? And it was kind of interesting that the discussion was all about nationality means something very interesting. There's lots of different things, but as soon as we started to talk about a national literature, we slipped right back into this idea of a nation state or something very, very restrictive.
We'll take a lady question here then.
There's no microphone.
And so, if you...
Okay, I'll try to project. I just had, I would like to hear the panel's opinion on being a writer and I suppose the tendency or the importance of maybe not living in the place where you've come from or where you've been born. I'm thinking of Irish writers like James Joyce or Samuel Beckett, who it was only when they were in exile, whether it was forced or whether they chose to live in exile, that's when they really found their voice, where they found their audience, and maybe where they found the freedom to express themselves, but also a perspective on their identity. And I'd just like to hear your opinions on that. And the second thing is just, it's, maybe from your own experiences, for those of you who write in more than one language, and I'm just interested in hearing whether you find that you have a different voice when you write in another language. Because I just wonder if the language, if you can express yourself in a different way through a different language, does that mean that your writing is in some way different or altered?
I think age gives us perspective, and I think those men, as they got older, had perspective on earlier life. Certainly Joyce was writing about earlier life, a lot of his later life. And I think that gives us perspective no matter what age we are. And I go back to saying I think everyone's an outsider. And I think it's a bit of a writer's cliche to say, oh, you have to be an outsider to see. I think that's bollocks. I think if you take some bloody time and pay attention to what's going on, you'll see. At any age. But I do think age helps perspective.
Yeah, I wouldn't entirely agree with bollocks there, but I agree with part of that. I think I don't entirely buy that you have to be an exile thing. There was an idea in Welsh writing 30 years ago. There was actually a collection of poems called Exiles All, and it argued that we were all inner exiles, given the cultural conditions that we were in. And that was a kind of fashionable way of looking at it for a while. I don't think you need to be an exile. In my own case, I mean, I know my own life has been informed by the fact that my father, before I was born, managed to get out of the pit where he was working. Very talented man for getting himself into trouble, and got into the army in the 1940s and spent nearly 3 years in India, Burma, then in China and Japan. And got the living daylights scared out of him. And I sort of imbibed his perspective, his internationalist perspective on that. And he went away as a bit like Stella's dad, as a good socialist who wanted to fight fascism, and as a hater of the British Empire. And he came back with his hatred of the British Empire underlined dozens of times, much more powerfully. He learnt on the ground what it was, and he came back much more firm in his convictions than he went. And I think that's kind of, in a way, my father did my exile for me, if exile is what you need. But I'm not convinced that you need it anyway. I mean, even going away to university, I'm old enough for that to have been a profoundly different experience when I went off to university. There's also something happened to me a few years ago where I had a friend from New Zealand, as a matter of fact, living in the town where I live. And he said to me one day, I won't do the accent. I'll cause offence if I try the accent. He said to me one day, "Where are you from, Chris?" And I said, I'm from a town about 26 miles away, the other side of those mountains. And he looked at me and he said, have you ever thought of leaving home? And the same day, as it happened, a radio company came to interview me, a Welsh language radio company, because I just had a book out. And the interviewer said to me, "So where are you from, Chris?" And I came up with exactly the same line in Welsh. And I said, well, I'm from 26 miles away, just the other side of that range of mountains. And the interviewer said to me, "Have you ever thought of going home?" To him, I was an exile, and it's the village thing that's going on. As far as, does your voice change when you change languages? I mean, I don't write a lot in Welsh, but I translate Welsh. But there's an old line that you don't speak the language speaks you. But I mean, there's a great deal of discussion about to what extent language informs how we think, and the connection between language and thought. And it's a very fierce debate at a theoretical level and among neuroscientists and so on. And I'm very interested to see whether the current developments in neuroscience will ever find us an answer to this. It may be that they will. But I think it does, working between languages, I think you learn about conceptual differences. I mean, the word for civilization in Welsh, for instance, is gwareiddiad. And the word civilization in English contains in it, and in most other languages, contains in it the idea of living in a city. Civis, citizen. It's all kind of in the word there. In Welsh, there's no connection etymologically at all with living in towns or cities. In English, again, we use the word urbane for someone who's kind of, understanding and liberal, and it's connected to the idea of living in a town. Those words contain a prejudice against people who live not in towns. It's associated with barbarism. Whereas in Welsh, the word gwareiddiad is connected with the idea of gwar, which means decent. It's connected with an idea of decency. And to me, that speaks volumes for a certain cultural difference, even between two linguistic cultures that grew right next to one another. It profoundly informs the way you look at the world. And I mean, I guess people who live who know languages that are further apart than those two, gain more insight. I think there's a huge amount to gain from knowing even a little bit about other languages. And I speak as somebody who only speaks two. And I take my hats off to people who can work and live their lives in more than two languages. They astonish me. And I wish I could do it. I think I would probably blow too many fuses to be able to write if that happened, though.
As for Joyce and Beckett leaving Ireland, I think it's less to do really with getting perspective than with the fact that Ireland was a particularly stifling environment at the time for an artist, and Paris was a particularly inviting one. And I mean, Beckett was quite vocal about it on several occasions. He said that he'd rather he described Ireland as the Irish state as having been buggered into existence by the English government and the Catholic Church, and declared that he'd prefer Paris in wartime to Dublin in peacetime. Though when he was asked by a journalist, having escaped Ireland and having escaped the English language, he was asked whether he considered himself an English writer, and his answer memorably was au contraire.
Any more, Cap? Could you, as a writer who grew up in one language now?
I just want to something very quickly about exile. I think we mustn't confuse exile with traveling. I think exile has become quite a fashionable word, and some people say they're exiled in Paris. I mean, these Irish writers were not really exiled. Exile is when you can't go back because they'll shoot you, or because a wall has gone up. That's exile, and I think that is the example you gave is again very specific to the Irish experience, perhaps, but also if you think in terms of walls, real walls, and the writers they have produced. The Berlin Wall produced, you might argue, Milan Kundera, who, in fact, when he sort of deserted to France, was stripped of his. He was Czechoslovakian. It was the time of Czechoslovakia, so he was stripped of citizenship until he acquired French citizenship. Nabokov is another example. Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet. Who knows what kinds of writers these people would have been had there not been that wall, and had they stayed at home and, you know, written from within a different kind of culture or environment. But I just wanted to kind of, I get a bit irritable when people sort of use exile too much, because I think it's not romantic. Exile is not romantic. It's a fracture. It's a scary thing, and you know, we're lucky, all of us in this room, not to be truly exiled. I guess when I use the word exile, that we are all exiled, I meant it in a spiritual sense. We are exiled from the past because we can't go back. Yeah, that's all. I think the rest is travel and luck.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have run out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. The ideas of nationality is something that is generating and is with new generations. The idea of I think how personal our belonging and our connection to the world and to our kind of our makeup and identity and makeup. And also I think what's been highlighted is the importance of language and celebrating language and not being tied down into the English language, because I think there was that, you know, language represents the world, but it doesn't represent it completely. And the more we play with language and celebrate language, I think it's the more we kind of have perspectives on our world. So yes, thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. Thank you very much for your questions and your comments. A huge thank you to our panelists for their speeches and their readings and their responses. They'll be hanging around. There are books to sign at the back. And there is more drinks afterwards as we can celebrate the funeral of a word. And a huge round of applause, please, for our panel. Thank you.